The Feynman technique is an extremely popular technique. It's been shared all over YouTube. Loads of creators, individual creators, team creators, lots of educational creators are talking about it. But when you look at the references, so look into the description for the references for where the Feynman technique came from, or to look at some of the science behind it, there are very, very few references, and the references I could find, I went to the articles, and the articles kind of just reference the videos, or they reference other articles that are also referenced in the videos, and there's just a big circle. So I thought, you know what, let's have a look at the academic research. And there were three papers. There were three total papers. One of them was in Chinese, so I couldn't read it. One of them was very limited on what it said, but it didn't really say anything useful. And the other one actually said the Feynman technique didn't work. From their findings, they said that there was no significant difference. So I decided to have a look at universities, see if any universities had said anything about any of their experiences. A couple of universities do explain the Feynman technique, but they just go through the 4 steps, just like every other article and video that I could see. So I thought, you know what, let's have a look and see if the Feynman technique actually came from Feynman. So I went to look at some of the books and look at Wikipedia page, look at Richard Feynman Wikipedia page, and no, it doesn't. What I actually found going through the research is that Richard Feynman actually had nothing to do with the Feynman technique. The technique was named after him, but he had literally nothing to do with it. And where this seems to have come from is there was a book written about Richard Feynman back in 1992, and there was an individual that decided, you know what, I'm going to do a video about this, and they summarized some of the things in the book and created this technique from some of the stories that were mentioned, and they did a video, and then they did a blog, and then all the other blogs and videos seemed to just start spouting out this Feynman technique with no real citation or reference. So I thought, you know what, let's go to Richard Feynman himself, sort of, and have a look at what he says. I also want to cover an addition, Einstein's quote that seems to be bumped with this Feynman technique all the time, all over the place. And the quote, Thomas Frank, you are right,
attributed to Albert Einstein, though he probably didn't actually say it.
And from what I can see, it's not. What Einstein actually said was this: that all physical theories, their mathematical expressions apart, ought to lend themselves to so simple a description that even a child could understand them. Now, mathematical expressions are completely different from the concepts that we are learning, the ideas that we are learning and trying to put together. Mathematical equations are somewhat proven, they're true. A lot of the concepts and things that we're trying to link together are not so linear. And when you actually hear Richard Feynman himself saying that he's not going to be able to explain magnets, you start to ask some questions.
So I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to why magnets attract each other, except to tell you that they do.
So hearing this, I really started to ask questions about how Richard Feynman would actually think about this Feynman technique that seems to have come out, because if he can't explain magnets to this individual, I don't know how old the individual interviewing them was, but I'm pretty sure they're older than 5, then how does this work? So let's break down the technique. Well, you need to isolate a topic, find a topic. I think that's fairly obvious. If you want to learn anything, you need to decide what you're going to learn. Explain this topic, this thing, to someone else or yourself, because the Feynman technique works with yourself, so you could be talking to yourself or talking to someone else. But when you do that, there will be a question. There will most likely be a question as to why this, why that, or could you explain this further? Because when you are explaining something, there's not going to be a definite, yes, that is how everything works. There's going to be a why question in there somewhere.
Now, when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking why.
So as soon as that first why question is asked, you could go down a rabbit hole and constantly ask why to almost everything, and you end up going into a bit of a loop, a bit of a downward spiral, asking why to everything like children used to / still do now. So this means going down this spiral of rabbit hole of asking whys, you could get to an interesting question, or more likely, lots of interesting questions to explore at some point, but it does mean that you need an answer to that interesting question, and a good enough answer to that question to move on.
For example, you could go, well, why did she slip on the ice? Well, ice is slippery. Everybody knows that, no problem. But you ask, why is ice slippery? That's kind of curious. Ice is extremely slippery. It's very interesting. You say, how does it work? So you could either say, I'm satisfied that you've answered me, ice is slippery, that explains it. Or you could go on and say, why is ice slippery?
When deciding if an answer is good enough for you, it's a little bit easy because you can work out whether you need to ask other questions, what other answers you would give, how deep a level of understanding you need about the topic for the essay, for the assignment, for the article you might be writing, and then you can also ask, okay, what citations, what synthesis, what critique, what references do I have to justify the answer that I've given to make it satisfactory for my own personal needs. But when you're explaining something to a child or someone else, you need to understand what their satisfactory answer is. So you need to understand what their understanding is, what citations they're happy with, what references they're happy with. Maybe a satisfactory answer is that because it does. In that case, great. If not, how far do those why questions go?
I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult a why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not.
Now in this explanation of this thing, this topic to ourselves or this other person, we need to understand what understanding is, what level of understanding is to us, to them, to everyone that's involved in the conversation.
Now when you ask, for example, why two magnets repel, there are many different levels. It depends on whether you're a student of physics or an ordinary person who doesn't know anything or not.
Let's just think about that for a second. So a physics student is going to have a different level of understanding to start with than a normal lay person. So a different level of understanding will change the explanation. So an increased level of understanding will increase the depth of explanation, and a decreased level of understanding is going to decrease the depth of explanation. And that kind of goes against what the Feynman technique is doing, because the Feynman technique is explaining something in simple terms to a 5-6-year-old, but a 5-6-year-old is going to have a lower level of understanding about the topic. So if we're looking to learn or expand on something that we don't know, we need to be explaining something to someone else that has a level of understanding that can challenge our own. And if we're checking our own level of understanding, well, if we are, for example, let's put some arbitrary numbers on this, if we are at level 2 understanding and we're explaining something to level 1, well, we're only explaining in level 1 understanding. But if we want to get to level 4 or level 5 understanding, well, we can't check level 4 or level 5 understanding if we're explaining something to a level 1, because they won't be able to understand or fathom what it is that you're talking about because there's no reference points.
I can't explain that attraction in terms of anything else that's familiar to you.
Now, when we're explaining something, and it needs to be in terms that they are familiar with for them to understand, well, if we're explaining something to a 5-6-year-old, they're not going to have the same amount of experience as you are in the topic or in the area. So the familiar terms are going to be much lower in depth of understanding in that topic or area. Now, if you're explaining it to yourself, well, it's going to be the same level of understanding. You're going to be able to explain the terms to yourself. So now you're not doing the Feynman technique because you're not explaining it to a 5-6-year-old. You're explaining it to someone like you, like yourself, whether that is an expert professor or that's just someone learning something at school. Now, because the Feynman technique is explaining things to 5-6-year-olds, we can't use complex terms, and not being able to use complex terms does limit how we can explain things.
If you were a student, you'd go further. I could go further. I could tell you that the magnetic forces are related to the electrical forces very intimately.
Again, this is Richard Feynman saying that if the person you're explaining something to knows more, you can go in more depth, which goes against the Feynman technique. For me, this is suggesting that when you're explaining something to someone else, it needs to be to someone that understands the topic like you, just below you or above you, so that you can ask questions to go deeper or answer questions that could make you ask questions to help you, again, go deeper. Now, looking at step 3 of this technique and going back and trying to find gaps in our explanation, well, we need to go and explore those gaps. And I think that isn't something we need to be told. I mean, when we are children, we learn something, we try and learn something new or understand something. If we want to, and if we care enough about learning that thing, we're going to do it again, or try it again, or try and figure it out. So this step 3 is just a natural way of us for learning. Okay, I didn't understand that. Do I care enough about learning that thing? Yes, let's go and do it again. Or let's try and understand that question. If I don't care, I'm not going to do it. That is then linked to motivation of learning, why you're learning, what you're learning for, which isn't going to be in the Feynman technique. That would then be in study motivation and drive, which is completely separate. Then step 4, which is explaining something in a narrative or in a story, is looking back at the quote from Richard Feynman's book, is just applying whatever it is that you understand to the world. So it's using the information that you understand, using the explanations in practice, whether that is in the lecture practice. So as a lecturer, he was explaining all of these topics because he wasn't in space doing the stuff, he was explaining it. But in a more practical field, like sports coaching, my field, or strength and conditioning, using the information in practice. So if it's theory, maybe it's talking about it or discussing it, because that is in practice. You're using it in a narrative. If it's a practical skill, it's actually doing the thing. Now again, I don't think we need a step 4, a technique to say, okay, go and use this, otherwise you're going to lose it, because we already know from children and learning that if we don't use something, we lose it. So the Feynman technique is not from Feynman, it's just named after Feynman, and from what I can tell, Feynman wouldn't actually agree with some of the things that are mentioned in the Feynman technique, and the Einstein quote that's normally associated with this Feynman technique isn't actually from Einstein, and he actually kind of disagrees again with what is applied in the Feynman technique, and the main area of the Feynman technique is one element, because 3 of them are natural learning processes, and then you have the explanation element, which the explanation element is a type of learning. It's called dialogic learning. Dialogic learning essentially is just conversations, and it's a valid method of learning with loads of research and literature support, unlike the Feynman technique that supports loads of different elements of conversations, how to have conversations, what to do in the conversations, different ways that you can move the conversations along, different people to involve in conversations, different lengths of conversations, and loads of different ways to talk and explain things to help learning. But I don't think we can or should call the Feynman technique dialogic learning, because firstly, it kind of ignores all of the researchers in pedagogics and learning that have gone and done the time to explore dialogic learning, and this technique is then named after the physicists that just happen to be really smart at physics and not understand all of the elements of dialogic learning, which is a little bit of an insult to those researchers. Secondly, and I probably should have put this first, but most importantly, the element of explanation to a 5-year-old or explaining something in simple terms actually goes against a lot of the research of dialogic learning, because you need to have a conversation with someone that understands the level of understanding that you are at to then challenge your development of learning. Editor Danny here, just adding something in. So even though I mentioned a 5-6-year-old all the way through the video, it still applies to someone's understanding. So you explaining something to someone's understanding that's far lower than you, using those arbitrary numbers before. If you're at level 4 or 5 and you're explaining something to a level 2 or a level 1, they don't have to be 5-6-year-olds. Their just level understanding is far below yours. The same principle applies in that you're not really testing your own depth of understanding, so you're not going to get anything from it. And vice versa, the reversal effect, the expertise reversal effect, works the other way. So if you are that level 4 or 5, that professor trying to explain something to the level 1, level 2, the student, there's going to be a big gap in understanding, which makes it harder for the individual to actually learn what's going on. So it doesn't help the professor, the you if you're the level 5, and it doesn't help the level 1 or level 2, depending on which part you are, whether you're the professor at level 4 or 5 or whether you're the student at 1, 2. Either way, it doesn't help. And third, I think the technique misses out a critical element in learning, which is asking questions. If you don't perceive a gap in your explanation, so if you're explaining something to a 5-year-old and they didn't have any questions and they fully understand something, you're not going to have any questions, so you're not going to expand your knowledge and deepen your understanding. And the same thing, if you explain something to yourself and you don't perceive any gaps, well, you're not going to ask any questions, because that's not what the technique tells you to do. So if you don't ask any questions, again, you can't have deeper levels of understanding. So you need to be exposed to something that you don't understand, because we don't understand what we don't understand, because we don't know what we don't know. So we need to either have the ability to ask questions to explore deeper levels of understanding, which is a skill in itself, or we need to be talking with someone that triggers those questions. Again, not part of the Feynman technique. I have my note on the technique linked in the description below, but most of my notes on learning are work in progress. So if you do want to go and explore some of Feynman themselves, go have a look at the Wikipedia page, and there are like 160 references on there, so worth having a look.